What happens when one of the most controversial conservative figures in America walks onto a stage built on empathy, unity, and emotional resonance? And what happens when that stage belongs to Oprah Winfrey, a woman whose name alone commands reverence across generations? The studio lights pulsed warmly over the audience, creating a gentle illusion of safety. Applause rose like clockwork. The camera swept across rows of eager faces, and the host smiled with that signature blend of grace and control. But beneath the surface, the air was thick with something else. Something colder, heavier. The kind of silence that exists right before the storm begins. Matt Walsh entered the studio with calculated composure. Dressed in dark tones, clean-shaven, his eyes moved slowly across the room like a man taking mental inventory of enemy terrain. There were no theatrics, just an eerie quiet as he walked to his seat across from Oprah, who rose to greet him with an outstretched hand and a curious smile. The applause waned. Even the cameras seemed to slow their movement, aware of the ideological powder keg now occupying center stage. "Thank you for being here, Matt," Oprah said, her voice smooth, disarming. "Thanks for having me," he replied. Neither one blinked. The opening minutes were polite but fragile, like glass stretched too thin. Oprah asked about the film, the process, the reaction. Walsh answered evenly, careful not to tip the balance too soon. But already his phrasing sent ripples through the room. In the wings, producers watched monitors with bated breath. One assistant whispered to another, "This is going to go sideways." Oprah crossed her legs and leaned forward, ready to pivot. Matt adjusted his mic. Neither of them moved quickly, but the mood had already shifted. The questions that were coming would not be safe. And neither would the answers. The walls of the studio were soundproof, but they couldn't muffle the emotional tremors building beneath the surface. Oprah's audience, typically composed of longtime fans who viewed her as a cultural compass, was now split. Some had come intrigued by the promise of a bold conversation. Others had come prepared to disapprove. But all of them sat alert, aware that this was not going to be a soft-seated celebration. The air felt denser than usual, like something sacred had been interrupted. And at the center of it stood two people. One, a cultural icon of progress. The other, a provocateur known for striking matches in ideological gas stations. Oprah kept her voice low and deliberate, the way one speaks to a guest who may or may not flip the table. "Matt, your documentary has stirred quite a response. Some say it's asking important questions. Others say it's attacking marginalized communities. What do you think you're doing with this film?" It was the first question with weight. The crowd leaned in. Walsh didn't hesitate. "I'm asking a question no one wants to answer. What is a woman?" If that question offends people, maybe the problem isn't the question. It wasn't defiant, but it was sharp, measured, the kind of statement that made half the room nod and the other half shift uncomfortably in their seats. The camera cut to Oprah, who gave the faintest smile, polite, practiced, but tinged with something else. "It's one thing to ask a question," she replied slowly. "It's another thing to imply you already know the answer and everyone else is just confused." That line earned a few murmurs from the audience, the beginning of a swell. Oprah was pulling them in. Matt tilted his head slightly as if weighing whether to engage or hold fire. He chose engagement. "I'm not here to confuse anyone. I'm here to bring clarity. That's something I thought this platform used to value." The tension spiked. The studio had transformed into a powder keg, and the match had just been struck. Matt Walsh had never been one for theatrics, but there was something undeniably theatrical about the way he sat. Spine straight, fingers interlaced, voice even. To some, it read as restraint. To others, it read as arrogance. He spoke like a man with nothing to prove and everything to clarify. Oprah, ever the master of emotional tempo, kept her tone measured, but the audience could feel the undertow. The interview was shifting beneath their feet, and the man in the brown blazer wasn't here to be liked. He was here to draw lines, and he wasn't blinking. The conversation veered into Walsh's upbringing, his values, and what he called the disintegration of truth. He described a culture where biology had become debatable, where language was redefined to suit feeling, and where, in his view, saying simple truths had become acts of rebellion. The crowd rumbled again, low murmurs, a few audible scoffs. Oprah nodded, her face a study in studied neutrality. "You say these things like they're objective," she said gently. "But identity isn't a math equation. It's lived. It's felt. It's complex." Matt's response was immediate. "And feelings don't rewrite chromosomes. Complexity doesn't erase reality." That line landed hard. The silence afterward was suffocating. Oprah held her gaze steady, but her lips tightened just enough for the front row to notice. Backstage, a floor manager glanced nervously at the segment timer. They were only 12 minutes in, but it felt like the midpoint of a war. The camera operators, seasoned as they were, adjusted for tighter shots. This wasn't about the whole stage anymore. It was about the eyes. Oprah's, Matt's, the audience's. All locked in a slow-burning standoff, wondering who would flinch first, and knowing that whoever did would lose control of the room. There's a certain power in Oprah's silence. A pause so deliberate it turns the air thick. She leaned back in her chair now, letting Matt's last remarks settle like dust after a controlled demolition. "You know, Matt," she began, her voice velvet-lined but edged with steel, "your version of truth has consequences. You speak as though ideas exist in a vacuum, but they don't. People live inside these conversations, and some of them are barely surviving." The audience stirred, murmurs of agreement, sharp inhales. The room was choosing sides, and Oprah knew it. She let the weight of her words settle before pressing on. "So, when you come here with your facts and your firmness, I have to ask, what do you believe your responsibility is to the people listening?" Walsh didn't flinch. "My responsibility is to the truth, not to someone's emotional response to it. If truth makes us uncomfortable, maybe that's the point. Maybe we're supposed to be uncomfortable when the foundations are cracking." It was the kind of answer that seemed both stoic and incendiary. Oprah's smile remained, but it had shifted. A degree colder, more surgical. She nodded slowly. "So, discomfort is the goal? Or is it just collateral damage?" That line landed like a warning. Audience members exchanged glances. Even those unsure of where they stood were now alert, sensing the temperature in the room rise by the second. Behind the cameras, the director gestured for tighter frames, a boom mic dipped lower. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was intellectual combat, and Oprah had just unsheathed her blade. Her questions were no longer inquisitive. They were cross-examinations dressed in charm. Matt stayed steady, but a vein in his temple had begun to pulse. His voice remained calm, but his eyes gave him away. He knew what was coming. And so did Oprah. Her next pivot wouldn't be about facts or science. It would be personal. And it would burn. "You have children, don't you, Matt?" Oprah asked, her tone deceptively light, as if she were shifting to safer ground. But everyone in the room, especially Matt, knew better. This wasn't small talk. This was the slow turn of a key in a locked door. Matt nodded. "I do." Oprah leaned in slightly. "And what would you say if one of them came to you, earnestly, sincerely, and told you they felt different than the gender they were assigned at birth?" The question floated in the air for a moment, heavy as iron. The audience quieted, holding its collective breath. Everyone knew this was the pivot, the moment where ideology met blood. Matt took a moment, then answered with surgical precision. "I would tell them I love them, unconditionally. But I would also tell them that feelings don't define reality, that our bodies matter. That truth isn't fluid just because culture says it is." The words were sharp, deliberate, and devoid of apology. Oprah blinked slowly. "So you would correct them?" she asked. "You wouldn't accept their lived experience?" Her tone was soft, but the implication struck like a whip. Matt nodded again, firm. "I would guide them. The same way I guide them away from lies about anything else." A ripple passed through the crowd. Some gasped, others clapped. But the division was now fully visible, etched across the faces in the audience like fault lines. Oprah's smile faltered for just a second, replaced by a look that only the seasoned could read. Disappointment cloaked in restraint. "That's a heavy decision," she said quietly. "And a dangerous one." The moment stretched long and thin. In the wings, a producer held a hand just above the cut to commercial button. They wouldn't use it, not yet. But the fact that it was hovering said everything. This conversation had left the realm of television and entered the realm of fire. Oprah's tone shifted now, not in volume, but in purpose. Gone was the warm, maternal cadence of a guide. What emerged was the deliberate tempo of someone issuing a challenge. "You speak as though gender is fixed," she said, "as though there is no space for experience, no room for becoming." Her eyes locked onto Matt, her voice silk over steel. "But what if the soul knows something the body doesn't?" It wasn't just a question. It was a declaration, and the audience recognized it instantly. A wave of applause erupted, spontaneous and heated. Oprah had thrown down her first real gauntlet. Matt sat forward, elbows resting on his thighs. His voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it deepened. "The soul and the body are not at war, Oprah. We've created that war with language. Gender is not a costume. It's not a feeling. It's a biological reality, not a poetic abstraction." The audience responded with a mixture of tension and disbelief. A few clapped, a few booed. Most just sat frozen, locked in the grip of an exchange that had turned the air electric. Oprah nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a hard line. "And what about the people who don't fit your definitions? Are they just confused to you? Broken?" Walsh's reply came fast. "They're not broken. They're being lied to. There's nothing compassionate about affirming confusion." That was it. The word confusion rattled through the room like a detonator. The audience, no longer neutral observers, reacted viscerally. Some shouted, others whispered. One woman in the second row stood abruptly, only to be gently ushered back down by a floor manager. Oprah didn't interrupt the reaction. She let it live, breathe, expand. And then, with the soft precision of someone wielding a blade, she said, "You call it truth. But to the people hearing you right now, it sounds like cruelty dressed as clarity." That line didn't land. It detonated. The moment Oprah uttered the title of Matt's documentary, the room stiffened like a held breath. "Let's talk about your film," she said, drawing the words out slowly. "You call it, 'What is a Woman?' as if the question is simple. But do you really believe it has a single answer?" The way she asked it, not as a trap, but as a dare, shifted the energy again. The audience leaned in, divided yet fascinated. Matt didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "I believe truth is singular. Womanhood is not a vibe, not a declaration. It's biological. That's not hate. That's clarity." Oprah tilted her head, narrowing her gaze. "Then what do you say to the women in this audience who were born in bodies you don't recognize, but who know, deep in their bones, that they are women?" Her voice remained calm, but her words were needles. Matt paused just long enough for the silence to tighten, then replied, "I say biology doesn't change because someone believes it does. Belief and truth aren't synonyms." The tension became visible. A few audience members clapped, a few groaned. One man in the back muttered, "Unbelievable," loud enough for a mic to catch it. And still, neither guest nor host blinked. The discussion wasn't a debate anymore. It had become a fracture, live and on air. Oprah's face shifted from composed to resolute. "Words have power," she said, "and the way you use them has impact far beyond this room." Matt nodded once. "Exactly. That's why I choose them carefully." The room had turned cold, like oxygen was being siphoned from it. The dividing line had been drawn not with volume, but with vocabulary. What is a woman? Wasn't a question anymore. It was a litmus test. And now everyone in the studio, on stage, behind the cameras, in the seats, was being forced to answer it in real time. The applause sign lit up, but only a fraction of the audience responded. The rest sat in stunned silence, their faces a mosaic of discomfort, admiration, and disbelief. Oprah's producers knew this look. It wasn't boredom, it was confrontation fatigue. They had watched this audience cry with Oprah, laugh with her, rise with her. But now they were stuck between their reverence for her legacy and the razor-sharp tension spilling across the stage. One wrong turn, one too bold sentence, and this entire room could tilt into chaos. And Oprah knew it. She shifted tactics. "Matt," she said softly, "you've been accused of using your platform to marginalize people who already feel unsafe in their own skin. Does that bother you?" Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were locked in. Matt took a breath. "What bothers me is that we've made disagreement synonymous with harm. I'm not trying to make anyone unsafe. I'm trying to stop a culture from collapsing under the weight of denial." The crowd's reaction was audible this time. Gasps, scoffs, and one isolated clap that died in midair. For the first time, even the camera operators looked rattled. This was not the kind of Oprah moment they were used to capturing. A woman in the front row raised her hand, visibly trembling. "Can I say something?" she asked aloud, her voice fragile but determined. Oprah glanced at her, then at her producers offstage. A subtle shake of the head came back. "Don't break the format." Oprah turned back to Matt instead. "It's easy to speak from conviction," she said, "when you're not the one paying the price for what's said." Matt's expression hardened. "I'd argue we're all paying the price. The difference is, some of us just admit it." The crowd stirred again. The divide wasn't ideological anymore, it was emotional. This wasn't a conversation. It was a rupture. And the wound was still wide open. The stage lights dimmed as the director finally cut to commercial. But the break didn't relieve the tension, it only magnified it. The studio didn't relax, it simmered. Oprah leaned back in her chair, eyes closed for a beat too long, breathing in the storm she had knowingly invited. Matt sat unmoving, his fingers steepled under his chin, eyes fixed on the floor like a man preparing for the next round. Behind the cameras, crew members moved quickly but without speaking. It was the kind of silence that said, "This went further than anyone expected, and no one knew how to pull it back." Backstage, the control room buzzed with quiet panic. One producer whispered into a headset, "Do we pivot? Do we lighten the tone?" Another shook her head. "Too late, they're locked in. We can't make this cute again." A third voice cut through, "Let it ride. This is the moment." Meanwhile, Oprah's assistant approached her at the edge of the stage with a note from legal. She read it, nodded once, and waved them away. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She glanced back at Matt. He hadn't moved. The calm was unnerving, like the eye of a hurricane. When the cameras returned, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to edge of rupture. The audience no longer clapped when prompted. The applause sign blinked silently in the background, ignored. Oprah leaned forward again, but there was no soft reset in her tone. "Matt, before we went to break, you made a point about denial. I want to ask, who exactly do you think is in denial?" Matt didn't pause. "Anyone who believes gender is a feeling. Anyone who thinks truth changes based on what hurts." The audience murmured, louder this time. The break hadn't softened the collision. It had just made sure everyone was strapped in for impact. There was no easing back into the conversation. Oprah's posture was straighter now, her voice more clipped. "Do you believe there's such a thing as gender dysphoria?" she asked. The tone wasn't curious, it was clinical, almost prosecutorial. Matt nodded. "Of course, it's real. But the treatment shouldn't be indulgence, it should be compassion rooted in reality." His phrasing, indulgence, triggered a visible recoil in several audience members. A murmur swept through the room like a wind brushing dry leaves. On camera, the moment looked still. But beneath the surface, it throbbed with unrest. Oprah didn't break eye contact. "So, when a child says, 'I don't feel right in my body,' your solution is to deny that child's experience?" Walsh responded without hesitation. My solution is to help that child understand that feelings don't dictate biological truth. Feelings can be powerful, but they aren't sovereign." His tone remained controlled, but there was tension now behind his jaw, pressure building behind the performance. Oprah let a beat pass, then, "And if that child suffers? If they self-harm? If they disappear into silence because someone told them their reality doesn't count? Do you own that too?" The room went dead quiet. That was the line, the one that cracked the floor beneath them. Walsh's expression didn't change, but his voice was slower when he answered. "We don't help children by confirming lies. We help them by guiding them toward truth." even if that truth is painful. The audience began shifting in their seats. Some nodded in reluctant agreement. Others shook their heads, appalled. One man whispered, "This is disgusting, just loud enough to be picked up on a nearby mic." Oprah glanced briefly toward the control booth. She knew they were past the point of no return. There was no rescue segment coming. This wasn't about gender anymore. This was about who got to define reality and who didn't. Matt Walsh had remained composed through the rising tension, but something in Oprah's last line had struck a nerve. "Who gets to define reality?" she had asked, her voice calm but loaded. It was the kind of question designed to expose either hubris or hesitation. Matt leaned forward now, hands clasped tightly, and for the first time his voice sharpened. "Reality defines itself," he said, louder than before. "What we're doing now, what you're doing, is pretending we can shape truth based on feelings and applause. That's not compassion. That's cowardice." The room gasped. Even Oprah's expression broke, her eyes narrowing, lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. For a moment, it felt like time fractured. Oprah didn't respond immediately. The crowd, once divided, had grown unsettled as one. One woman in the middle row stood abruptly and walked out. Another began to cry. Oprah finally broke the silence, but her tone was no longer polished. It was chilled steel. "So you think I'm a coward?" she asked, not looking away. Matt held her gaze. "I think what's happening on this stage, where truth is traded for applause, is dangerous. And yes, I think enabling delusion while calling it love is cowardly." The words were blunt, unforgiving, and utterly sincere. They rang out like a gavel. That was the moment everything shifted. Oprah's production manager stepped forward from the shadows, signaling something to the control booth. The floor director reached for the mute toggle but didn't use it. They all understood what was coming now. Oprah sat back, folding her hands slowly, as if trying to contain what boiled beneath her calm. "You've made yourself very clear, Mr. Walsh," she said, "but this is my show, and I won't allow it to be used as a weapon." Matt didn't reply. He didn't need to. The explosion had already happened, and the blast radius would stretch far beyond the studio. Oprah adjusted the microphone clipped to her collar, her fingers steady, her eyes locked on Matt with the cool intensity of someone who had just shifted from conversation to command. "You came here knowing who I am, what this platform stands for," she said. "And yet you chose to provoke, not enlighten." Her voice no longer carried the invitation of dialogue. It carried judgment, the kind that needed no jury. "This was never about truth for you," she added. "It was about spectacle." The audience murmured again, their energy turning from discomfort to simmering condemnation. Matt didn't backpedal. "I came here to speak plainly, not to perform. If people can't handle that, it says more about the culture than it does about me." He wasn't shouting, but the steel in his voice had hardened. The veneer of civility was gone now, peeled back by relentless ideological friction. Oprah exhaled, a short, sharp breath. "Then speak plainly somewhere else," she said. "Because we don't traffic in humiliation here. We don't tolerate guests who use our stage to undermine people's humanity." The line landed like a gavel, and even those who had agreed with some of Matt's arguments were now unsure what side of the line he stood on. The studio's silence was pierced by a low hum in the control booth. A cue given, a decision made. Oprah turned to the audience, her back partially to Matt now, a deliberate act of disengagement. "We're going to take a brief pause," she said, voice firm, eyes scanning the room. "When we return, we'll be moving on." There was no commercial yet, no fade out, just the raw weight of a door closing. Matt sat still, unmoving. But in that moment, it didn't matter whether he stood or stayed seated. The eviction had already begun. And it came not from security, but from the authority of a host reclaiming her domain. Security didn't rush the stage. They didn't have to. The message had been delivered without force. Oprah's authority carried more weight than any command. A stagehand appeared discreetly from the side, murmured something into Matt Walsh's ear. He didn't react at first. Then, with mechanical precision, he stood up, adjusted his jacket, and looked straight into the audience. No anger, no retreat. Just a faint, unreadable smirk, like a man who had calculated the cost and paid it in full. The room stayed still as though even applause felt too fragile to risk. Oprah didn't look at him as he left. She stayed in her chair, eyes locked on the teleprompter ahead, the show already pivoting in her mind to the next guest, the next moment, the next safe harbor. But the silence behind her was louder than any ovation. Matt turned once before exiting, scanning the crowd. "Truth doesn't ask for permission," he said. Not shouting, not dramatic, just clear. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't even defiance, it was punctuation. And then he was gone. Off the stage. Out of the spotlight. Into a storm of headlines waiting to be written. Backstage, the corridors buzzed with tension. Oprah's crew moved quickly, their professionalism masking the shock that hung like fog. Matt passed a makeup artist who didn't meet his eyes. A producer whispered, "We're cutting that part." Another voice replied, "We can't." The whole thing's already trending. Outside, cameras and journalists had begun to gather. Word was out. The footage wouldn't need editing, it was already leaking. Clips were being uploaded, reshared, dissected in real time. In less than an hour, Walsh walks off Oprah would be the top story on every major feed. But this wasn't a walk-off, it was an expulsion, and the world knew it. In the green room, Matt Walsh sat alone for a moment before his publicist burst through the door, phone in hand, screen already flooded with headlines. "It's everywhere," she said flatly. "Clips, quotes, reaction videos. Oprah's team hasn't even put out an official statement yet, but you're already the #1 trend." Matt said nothing. He just nodded, as if this had always been the trajectory. He had entered the lion's den, said what he came to say, and left the wreckage behind. Now, the aftermath was just confirmation. A war he didn't start but had fully expected. Meanwhile, across the hall, Oprah's team was in full crisis mode. A circle of producers, PR reps, and legal advisors huddled in a dressing room turned command center. "We can't pretend it didn't happen," one of them said. "And we can't cut it. Too many audience phones were rolling." Another countered, "We frame it. We define it before they do." Oprah herself remained calm but decisive. "We address it. We release a statement. We own the space." It wasn't about smoothing the edges, it was about controlling the fallout before it controlled them. She knew the stakes, and she knew the eyes watching weren't just fans, they were critics, allies, and adversaries. Within the hour, both camps had prepared talking points. Matt's team leaned into the controversy, calling the moment a necessary confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Oprah's team, meanwhile, emphasized the importance of creating safe spaces for all guests and audiences, even in moments of disagreement. But the internet had already taken the reins. The footage wasn't being debated, it was being devoured. Memes, breakdowns, podcast segments, reaction tweets. The confrontation had left the studio, bypassed the edit room, and gone straight into digital immortality. The show was over, but the story had just begun. By nightfall, clips of the confrontation had saturated every major social platform. The video had no need for editing. It was raw, compelling, and impossible to look away from. One 10-second clip of Matt saying, "Feelings don't rewrite chromosomes," had already passed 2 million views. Another, showing Oprah turning away from him with the words, "Not on my stage," had become an instant meme. The internet didn't just watch, it reacted. People weren't simply engaging, they were choosing sides, sharpening their takes, and turning a moment into a movement. News outlets scrambled to catch up. Some framed the clash as a courageous stand for truth. Others called it an act of public cruelty masquerading as conviction. Hashtags lit up the feeds. #, Team Oprah. #, Walsh was right. #, Truth or Hate. Celebrities weighed in, some praising Oprah for holding the line, others lauding Matt for daring to speak what they called the unfiltered truth. And then came the think pieces, dissecting not just what was said, but how it was said, where the line between dialogue and damage truly lies. Every frame became fodder for cultural battle. In living rooms across the country, families argued. Friends texted links with one-word messages. Thoughts? Talk show hosts dedicated segments. college classrooms pulled the clip into discussion. It was no longer about Matt Walsh or Oprah Winfrey. It had become something else entirely. A flashpoint. A cultural moment that couldn't be ignored or explained away. One that didn't offer tidy resolution, only reflection. It wasn't just viral, it was viral with teeth, and the bite marks were already showing. While Matt Walsh's supporters hailed him as a truth-teller silenced for being correct, Oprah's camp faced a different challenge altogether. For the first time in decades, her role as the nation's emotional compass was being called into question. Some critics accused her of censorship, of ejecting a guest simply for disagreeing. Others argued she had shown restraint and strength in the face of calculated provocation. The divide wasn't just political, it was generational, cultural, and deeply emotional. Oprah's brand had always been about holding space. But now people were asking, space for whom? In response, Oprah released a brief but pointed statement. "The stage I host is not neutral. It's a space for dignity, for empathy, and for truth that does no harm. When that standard is violated, I act accordingly." It was vintage Oprah, polished, firm, unapologetic. Her words went viral almost instantly, reigniting the fire online. Supporters applauded her clarity. Detractors saw it as deflection, but no one saw it as weak. If anything, Oprah had reminded everyone why her name still carried gravity. She didn't flinch, didn't rebook, didn't walk back a thing. She was not cornered, she was commanding. Yet privately, inside media circles, speculation grew. Would advertisers pull support? Would future guests hesitate to appear? Had Oprah drawn a line in the sand or built a wall around her platform? Network executives were tight-lipped, weighing public sentiment against brand loyalty. But the numbers didn't lie. The episode's viewership was already shattering recent records. Whether she was under fire or in full control didn't matter to the bottom line. Controversy had drawn eyes, and Oprah, once again, was the axis around which a national conversation spun. Only this time, the question wasn't just what happened, it was who owns the right to shut it down? Matt Walsh didn't retreat after the broadcast, he doubled down. Within hours of the show's airing, he released a video titled, "I got kicked off Oprah's stage. Here's why that matters." Sitting behind his signature desk, his tone was composed but defiant. "I went on the most powerful daytime platform in America and told the truth," he began. "And for that, I was shown the door." He framed the ejection not as a defeat, but as validation. That the truth, when spoken plainly, was now considered too dangerous for daytime television. The video went viral in under an hour. In the clip, Walsh repeated many of his on-air statements but went further, accusing the show of staging an ideological ambush. Oprah didn't want a conversation, he said. She wanted compliance. And when she didn't get it, she ended the segment, because she couldn't control it. His supporters amplified the message, praising him for speaking truth to cultural tyranny. Conservative outlets rallied to his defense, booking him for interviews and inviting him to elaborate. Walsh had become, in their eyes, a martyr of discourse, someone punished not for hate, but for certainty. But critics weren't silent either. Dozens of mental health advocates, LGBTQ+ activists, and celebrities condemned his remarks as deeply harmful, accusing him of weaponizing language under the guise of truth. Some called for boycotts of the platforms that hosted him. Others urged people to watch the original footage for themselves, arguing the moment revealed more about Walsh's tactics than Oprah's restraint. And in the center of the storm stood Matt, calm, unrepentant, and fully aware that every replay of the clip only deepened his imprint in the culture war he'd spent years navigating. Whether praised or reviled, he was no longer just a commentator. He was a symbol. In the days that followed, the confrontation between Matt Walsh and Oprah Winfrey rippled outward, far beyond the soundstage. It became more than a clash over gender identity. It became a referendum on who holds the microphone and who gets silenced when the answers don't match the mood of the room. Editorials debated it, podcasts dissected it, politicians referenced it in speeches. And through it all, one question emerged louder than any slogan, any viral clip, any PR statement. Who gets to ask the hard questions? And who decides when they've gone too far? Oprah returned to her show the following week, composed as ever. She made no further mention of Walsh's name. Instead, she offered a reflection. Truth matters. But so does compassion. If we lose one chasing the other, we lose ourselves. It was classic Oprah, rooted in dignity, filtered through grace. But for many, it felt like a closing chapter. The moment had passed, but the tension remained. And Matt, for his part, continued to ride the waves of attention, transforming outrage into momentum. He was no longer just a guest. He was a lightning rod, polarizing, immovable, strategic. So, what do you think? Was Matt Walsh justified in standing his ground, or did Oprah simply enforce the boundaries of her platform? Was it courage, cruelty, or something messier in between? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and let us know who you want covered next. Because in a world where microphones double as weapons and questions can spark wildfires, sometimes the clash is the story, and sometimes it's just the beginning.